Hello and welcome to Analog Insights. In today's episode, I'm taking a closer look at the Yashica T3D, which is a 35mm point-and-shoot camera with autofocus, motor wind, integrated flash, and a fantastic 35mm f2.8 Carl Zeiss Tessar lens. The camera was manufactured by the Japanese company Kyocera in collaboration with Carl Zeiss AG and released in 1988. And Japanese cameras featuring these kinds of Carl Zeiss T-star lenses are known for combining excellent optical performance with the latest electronics of the era. The Yashica T3 and T3D are practically the same camera, except that the D here stands for a data bag, so you can potentially print the date and time of your frame or of the image that was taken into your frame. But unfortunately, in this particular case, the date range ends in 2019, and therefore it doesn't really make sense anymore to use this particular feature here. Also worth noting is that the Kyocera T-Scope and T-Scope 2 are also practically the same cameras, but branded differently. The Yashica T3D is a great example for so-called neo-vintage point-and-shoot cameras, and the term is interesting because of course it doesn't make a lot of sense linguistically, but it's something that, at least in my observation, came originally from the realm of watch collecting, where neo-vintage is used to differentiate between watches from the 1980s and 90s and earlier vintage watches from the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and so on. And slowly but surely this term is coming over to the realm of camera collection or collecting as well. And there's a fantastic British platform called Select Co that I think was launched in 2023, and they're exclusively focusing on these kinds of neo-vintage point-and-shoot cameras, basically selling Contax T3, T2, Leica Minilux, and similar models, and always in fantastic, really collector-grade condition. So if you are looking for one of those cameras in working order, I would point you in the direction of Select Co. I got this particular camera from my aunt, who used to work at Carl Zeiss, and I've mentioned that before in my Contax RTS review. And she purchased this particular camera new in the late 1980s, and as far as she explained it to me, primarily because of the Carl Zeiss lens that is featured in that camera, and because she was pointed in that direction, and she used it for all sorts of photography throughout the 1990s and beyond. And then at one point passed it on to me, and it was still perfectly fine. It has a little bit of a tape on the top plate here to keep certain parts together, but other than that, it's still working wonderfully, and yeah, served me quite well during all of my travels. So I typically have it with me as an additional camera when traveling, and also took it with me on my larger road trip that I did in November 2025 in California, basically starting in LA, going through the national parks all the way up to San Francisco. And here I also had it with me as a secondary camera and took all sorts of images that I, of course, wanted to integrate into this video. As always, the films were developed and scanned by my trusted On Film Lab in Frankfurt, and I can't wait to share the results here with you. So let's dive in there. So what about the features and the build quality? The Yashica T3D is just what you would expect from such a neo-vintage point-and-shoot. It's compact, well-built, and automatic. The camera comes with the aforementioned fast f2.8 Carl Zeiss Tessar lens with 4 elements in 4 groups, which is, by the way, the fastest of the so-called T-series cameras, despite the fact that the T3 model sits somewhere in the middle. In front of the lens is a protective slider that turns the camera on when opened, and the case is water resistant and even has an O-ring protection for the film door. Of course, you shouldn't use the camera underwater or submerge it, but if you're out and about in the rain, as I was here in Los Angeles, it's perfectly fine to use this camera. The programmed electronic shutter supports speeds from 1/630th of a second to 1 second and has an electromagnetic release. The electronic auto exposure system works with a silicon photodiode sensor, and the camera supports the X codes between ISO 64 and 1600. For non-DX film, the speed is automatically set to ISO 100, so it can only be manually changed if you're using those fake DX codes. As is common for such cameras, the film transport is completely automatic, so it auto-loads, it advances and rewinds once the roll is finished. So to manually rewind mid-roll, you need to press this button here, ideally with the tip of a pen or similar. The 16-zone autofocus already works at a distance of just 0.5 meters and can be locked using the common half-press trigger, and there is no infinity lock. The Albada type viewfinder displays the relevant 35mm frame, including an inner parallax correction mark for closer subjects, and it uses a green LED to indicate correct focus and blinks if there are focusing problems. A red LED indicates that the flash is currently charging and will fire during the next shutter release. The digital display on the top of the camera features a lens barrier open mark, exposure counter up to 39 frames, an autofocus mark, a battery level indicator, self-timer, flash status, and mode, as well as a long exposure warning. There is a self-timer feature that typically delays by 10 seconds and is indicated by a self-timer lamp, and it also can be cancelled if you change your mind. The built-in flash needs a 0.6 seconds recharge time at normal temperatures and comes with an automatic mode in low light, so it would automatically fire if you don't have enough light available. Then there's also a forced fire and a forced suppression, which of course is quite convenient, and many of those point-and-shoots don't have that feature. The flash range is 0.5 to 3 meters at ISO 100. The camera takes one 6-volt 2CR5 battery, which apparently lasts for 1500 frames if 50% of them are taken with a flash. In my real-life experience, you need to change the battery much more often, and you might also encounter lagging shutter speeds if your battery is running low and you continue to shoot with it. So it's always good to listen carefully to the shutter release sound and whether it makes sense to what you're seeing if you kind of expect your battery to be running low. A truly remarkable feature is the new angle scope that lets you frame your image through a waist-level viewfinder, similar to what you might know from a twin-lens reflex camera in the medium format realm. This feature comes quite handy if you want to take discrete street shots or taking group pictures or portraits in a less intrusive manner. The camera also features a tripod socket, and in the case of the T3D, the before mentioned data bag. The data bag runs with a built-in quartz clock and needs an additional 3-volt CR2025 battery, and the data bag makes the camera about 20 grams heavier and 2.5 millimeters thicker than the regular T3. Otherwise, they are really exactly the same, and the T3D here weighs around 300 grams and feels a bit hefty in comparison to later models, and also a little bit bigger, of course. You can clearly feel the late 1980s here, and still it's a very, very nice camera. So what about the image quality and results? In my opinion, the lens is amazing and reliably offers fantastic results. The lens offers sharpness across the entire frame, even at f2.8, and of course that is particularly sharp in the center and when closed down, but it still performs nicely into every corner when shot wide open. 35mm lens, as you know, is quite versatile in general, but this here, in this particular case, it helps that you can get relatively close and all the way down to 0.5 meters, which in my opinion creates the opportunity to get fantastic images. And sometimes for casual shots when you're out and about with friends or having dinner or something like that, it is quite a remarkably versatile camera, because in the next moment you can just say, hey, I want to take an image of that skyline here when I'm on a mountaintop looking over LA, for instance, or in the next moment I'm kind of in the streets and looking at a street shot that I want to take, and that's also perfectly fine. So the 35mm, in my opinion, are a perfect focal length for this kind of point and shoot camera, and you can kind of see it in the images and the variety of images that you can produce with this one here. Thanks to the built-in flash, the maximum aperture of f2.8 is not a problem. Only if you really don't like that look of having an additional flash in there, then it might turn into a problem. In my opinion, it's a really nice effect, and as mentioned before, I also personally really like forcing the flash into an image that already has enough light to give it a little bit of a fill flash, to have additional light and the front coming from the front, especially for portraits. You sometimes get that beautiful, surreal, editorial-like look when using the flash in addition to having nice background light. It can be really, really great, and it's all coming out of a relatively compact camera. The only downside that I noticed is that the lens tends to flare a little bit. So if you're shooting against the source of light, if you're shooting against the sun, it might produce some flaring here. But again, this effect can also look very, very nice. And I had a couple of images that I liked precisely because of that effect. So as always in these cases, it's a matter of taste to some extent. And personally, it was very hard finding any downsides of this particular lens, and also seeing how well it's performing after all these years. It's really, really remarkable. The only thing is, in terms of exposure, it would be nice to have a dedicated button for either exposure compensation or backlight compensation. You don't have that, and that's the only thing that is sometimes endangering your exposure, that you need to be careful when exposing frames where you're shooting against a strong source of light, that you still get a reading. And as I've mentioned before, this is sometimes the case where I just throw in the flash to make sure that I have enough light on the subject in the foreground. But other than that, there's no huge negative that I could find. I get remarkably great images and consistently with that particular camera. So what about the handling and my personal impressions? Most importantly, this camera is very hard to pocket, so it's comparatively bulky. And personally, it reminded me of the Sega Game Gear, a very nice device that sits nicely in your hands, but is always a little bit too bulky to really get pocketed and be used for that purpose. And in my opinion, you can really feel the late 1980s here, and it's a little bit too early to have all these electronics produced small enough to have a very, very sleek and nice package. This is what we then see in the course of the 1990s, of course. And this, I think, is the only downside of this camera in terms of its form factor. The operation is quite intuitive and straightforward as mentioned. The autofocus is relatively quick to respond and the built-in flash fires reliably. The only downside is that the shutter release button sometimes comes with an unclear actuation point, so it's sometimes hard to know, is this already the point where it will fire, or is it one step earlier, so to speak. So it sometimes takes a moment to half press it properly and for the camera to react. And the ergonomics are fantastic, and in my opinion the hand grip feels really great and solid. What bothers me most is all the automation in the camera, especially that it doesn't even show you the ISO that the camera selected. So you put in a film with the DX code and you're basically bound to hoping that it chose the correct ISO. That is typically not a problem at all, but once you're in the territory where you want to rate a Kodak Portra 400 at ISO 200 and you're using those fake DX codes, or you have a Kodak Tri-X that you want to rate at 1600 or so, then you're in the territory where you just have to rely on the camera accepting these fake DX codes accurately, and yeah, there's no possibility to double check before having it developed and then scanned. So this, in my opinion, is a little bit of a downside. Speaking of discrete shots and street shots, I've mentioned that before. It's a relatively noisy camera, especially the film advance, and this is interesting because the shutters itself is not particularly noisy. And what people apparently do, and I've read that online on Reddit, is if you continue to press the shutter release button after taking a shot, it's not advancing immediately. And some people report that they sometimes use that to take the discrete street shot, then hold the shutter release button and wait until they're far enough away to let go, and then have the advanced sound come out of the camera when nobody basically expects them to have taken a shot. And this I found interesting, that this is possible, and it's a little bit of a hack surrounding this camera. And in a similar vein, the new angle scope kind of waist level viewfinder is of course fantastic to take unobtrusive images, but it's also a little bit of a philosophical question whether you want to use it for that purpose. So it is really ideal if you're the kind of person who just want to look through a waist level viewfinder, have autofocus and press it. But of course the only downside here is then that you cannot double check whether the autofocus hit the spot that you're aiming for, so you would typically go for the middle. This is where it's focusing on, and then hope that it's getting the correct subject in your frame. The built-in flash works great as mentioned, but it needs to be turned off per shot. So if you don't want to use it and it's coming in automatically, or you want to turn it on, it also needs to be done per shot. So there's no feature to just say it should always stay on. The camera always reverts to the auto mode after you've taken a shot. An important note when discussing all these kinds of neo-vintage cameras here, they do come with electronics, and these electronics tend to get old over time, so the cameras might potentially die on you, which is a huge issue for the Leica Minilux and certain Contax cameras. It just can happen to you that suddenly a camera that cost you 800 euros or 1,000 or even more suddenly turns into a brick that is beyond repair, or very, very difficult to repair because they don't have the electronic pieces anymore. They don't have the original pieces. Sometimes it's very hard to find the circuits, and you need basically another damaged camera and then hope that it's working if you're taking those pieces. So they can potentially die on you, and this is, in my opinion, a good reason to rather look for the 200 to 300 euro range and maybe have some downsides, like here in this case a bit more bulky camera. And also I feel like these late 1980s cameras with a little bit of a more bulky form factor and a bit more space for the electronics tend to last longer and work more reliably than the ones where the focus was really on getting everything as small and as compact as possible. In my particular case, I dropped this camera accidentally in San Francisco because the strap became loose and it dropped on the concrete floor, and it's perfectly fine. It's still working reliably, and I'm not sure whether this kind of thing would work with the Contax T3. So Of course, you wouldn't drop a camera intentionally, or never do that. But as it happened to me, it can happen to you. And then I was personally quite happy in that situation to know it's just a 200 to 300 euro camera, and it probably is built solidly enough to work afterwards. So this, I think, is important to mention. Once you're hitting that neo vintage market, please bear in mind what the electronics can do and what they cannot do, and also read up on the statistics of and experiences of other people with that particular camera you have in mind. In my experience, the T3D here worked particularly reliable for decades. So, thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Analog Insights and my review of the Yashica T3D. In my opinion, this is a fantastic neo-vintage point-and-shoot camera with a remarkable lens, quick autofocus, but not so silent film advance, and it is a little bit hefty. But it's also not as expensive as other alternatives, and you still get that fantastic Carl Zeiss lens. If that is important to you and you just don't want to compromise on image quality when taking out a point-and-shoot, I can highly recommend taking a closer look at this particular camera and the Kyocera T-Scope 2 alternatives. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, please remember to like it and maybe even share it with your friends. And if you want to see more videos like this, please subscribe to our channel. Jules, Greg, and I really appreciate each and every subscriber coming our way. So thanks for watching. I hope to see you soon. Bye.